Hello, welcome to my recap of the game between Andrey Esipenko and Jorden Foreest from round 10 of Tata Steel. We had a very interesting game here, although it didn't seem like it in the opening. The opening was very ordinary, it was the Italian game. And after a couple of moves, you'll see why I think the opening was nothing special, because in this position, usually people play c3 and play the typical Italian structures. But here, Esipenko chose to play in the spirit of 4 knights, with the knight on c3. The downside of knight c3 is that the d4 square is under less control, but also the upside of this move is that the d5 square is under control, so black is not having an easy time to push d5 anytime soon. And to stop bishop g5, knight d5 ideas, with pinning the knight on f6, he plays h6. And now Esipenko plays bishop e3, tries to exchange this very strong bishop on c5. Foreest plays bishop b6, and now knight d5. White anticipates knight d5 by e d5 and capturing the pawn on e5, which would be very, very good for white. Even though the pawn is doubled, it's still a big advantage. So here, Foreest tries to continue his development by d6. Now Esipenko does the same. He plays h3, stopping bishop g4, and after bishop e3, which was played a couple of moves later, now Esipenko makes it more interesting. He plays fe3 and he opens up the f file, tries to castle next and to generate some counterplay on the semi-open f file. Now Jorden plays knight a5, tries to exchange knight for bishop. It's inevitable to exchange knight for bishop, because if the bishop goes to b5, there is c6 and you have to take like this, but eventually you will get trapped, let's say, trapped. White took here on f6, queen f6, and not to allow double pawns, he plays bishop b3 here. Black took ab, and now black castled. White castled, and to step away from the potential discovered attack, he goes queen e7. And also he wants to open up the f file. Queen e1 and now f5 by black. White took, and now rook takes. And maybe here the idea of white was to stop activating the bishop, so he played queen b4. Very interesting move. Stopping any bishop e6, bishop d5, stabilizing the position that way. This move provoked a weakness in black's position. Black played c5. The d5 square becomes weak, also the d6 pawn becomes backward. White went for queen e4, bishop e6, going for maybe d5. White does knight h4 to stop d5, because the knight can jump to f5 and attack the queen. We are at the crossroads. Does black want to exchange rooks, or does he keep it? He chose to keep it by rook g5, but you see how in this position the rook is a bit limited. It doesn't have lots of good squares to go, except h5, but that can also be changed by king h2, g4. The safest way to go here was to just exchange on f1, and it's not time to go rook f8 because of capturing, and now king cannot capture because of knight g6. And if queen takes, the b7 pawn hangs, so you have to play first queen d7 to have rook f8 next. And if white somehow stops it by knight g6, the knight is very active, but it also doesn't do much. Black can just wait with rook e8, and how does white improve? If he tries something like h4 here, it immediately activates the bishop. All of a sudden the position becomes really unpleasant for white. It's not so easy for white to improve on this position. If he tries queen f3, there is queen f7. What can you do? If queen h5, I think you just go back to d7 and you ask the same question. h4 is impossible because of bishop g4. That could be very nice. g4 seems like too much. Maybe bishop f7 would be a good answer to pin the queen and have maybe some unpleasant questions like rook e6. So you see how knight on g6 is just a cosmetic piece. It doesn't do much, it cannot go any further, and with rook e8, some potential knight e7 after queen h4 is stopped and white's play is not so rich anymore. But in the game, Foreest chose to play rook g5, making his rook a bit awkward. Now Esipenko tries queen f3. The issue with black's position is that the queen trade seems a bit unpleasing because black is playing with this rook on g5 completely offside, and it feels like black cannot afford queen trade or rook trade, so he has to keep some dynamic in the game so that rook on g5 doesn't feel so alone. Black plays a6 here to free his rook from a8 to maybe get to d8 or wherever, just to not be on a8. Now e4, fixing the structure, making d5 as a move much more unpleasing for black. And now rook d8 was played. What's strange in this position is that actually a move like rook f8 is quite fine, and if white decides to capture twice and go to h2, you might think that this endgame is just dead lost, because how do you ever get your rook out? The rook on a1 will find a way to break through. But actually the things are not so simple, because to maintain this rook on g5 you need to keep the knight on h4, and also you need to stop the rook from getting to g3, e3 and somehow getting out. So because of that, the things are not so simple, and if black tries to stop, let's say g4 by h5, white can try to play b4, but even after that, this seems like some kind of fortress, because even if you capture, he plays b5, and after breaking the queen side by c4, there's bishop d7. After cb, bishop b5, and it seems like black holds this. What's a problem for white in this position is that the d3 pawn is now a weakness, and let's say after this I can just skip some moves. Let's say king d7, and the issue for white here is that the d3 might become a target. If you try to activate your king, let's say by playing king g1, there's rook g3, and then the d3 pawn is weak, so you have to get out. But now rook g6 is allowed, and it's much easier for black. Also, if you go g3, there's this weakness on g3. You cannot get with the king to e3 if you want to allow the rook to go. You can go knight f5, of course, but it allows rook g6 and getting the rook out. So rook f8 worked. Rook d8 was played by black. Rook f2, trying to double on the f file at some point. And now king h7. Again, rook f8 worked. Like in the previous case, nothing happened, nothing drastically happened, but he chose king h7. King h2, making the queen free, because bishop h3 might come at some point with the king on g1. And now black plays queen c7, trying to go and expand on the queen side by a5, b5. And now queen e2. What was good here was to play g4 and get knight f5 next, with h4 and getting some momentum on the king side. But Esipenko tried to play more calmly. He played queen e2. He didn't want to force matters, and he played this. a5 by Jorden, rook a1, and now b5. He's going for a4 and trying to open up the queen side, maybe to potentially put some pressure on b2 pawn after these exchanges occur. And now Esipenko chose rook f8, trying to exchange one pair of rooks, which is in general a good thing, because the rook on g5 is still a very bad piece. But that doesn't stop Foreest to play a4. Esipenko took because b4 pawn is very, very weak. Takes, and now c4. He fixes the structure in the center, doesn't allow d5 forever, and black plays queen e7 here, although it's better to just go for queen b8. And the reason why it's better, it's forcing white to bring his rook back or to exchange. If he takes, queen takes, let's say rook f2 to just defend the pawn on b2, let's say this, queen f3 to get to f8, and in case of this, white still has some edge with knight f5, and the position becomes a bit unpleasant, but I think it's holdable by queen d7 and rook g6, rook f6. And in case of knight h4, still to have queen e7 or something like that. And I don't think it's possible to break this position without moving the knight from h4, but it allows the rook to go from g5 to g6. After queen b8, if he goes back to f2, I think it's even easier to play, because now after this, there is rook b8, and I think there is enough counterplay for black. Queen e7 was slightly imprecise, because it allows this move. And now there's no pressure on b2, which makes this exchange favorable to white. And here black plays bishop g8, making the bishop very passive. It was best to just wait with rook e8. How to continue here? Maybe rook f2 here, to cover the second rank. Because if you take immediately, there is an issue with this. If you take, queen takes, queen f8, you want to exchange queens, but there is this move, queen h5. After which you have to bring back your knight to f3. If you go here, then it's kind of a mutual Zugzwang. So if knight goes back to f3, there is rook g6, and the rook just gets out, and there's no time for queen d6 because of bishop h3. The reason why you have to play rook f2 is that after bishop h3 there is rook g2, and you don't have this move because of rook g2, king h1, and I think it's just losing. After, let's say, this, rook g5, the rook is attacked, the knight is attacked, and if rook f3, there is bishop g2, which loses. The reason why rook f2 is essential here is that it defends both g2 and b2 at the same time. And now the same exchange doesn't work. Let's say queen d7, I take, and now I have queen f8. Now the same story doesn't work for black, because after rook g6 there is this, and on bishop h3 queen e5, and now rook g2 is not possible because rook protects. You have to go either bishop f5, you need to exchange queens like this, and white is a pawn up, or to immediately take it, but or to do something like this and more or less get to the same position. After this, rook d6, and after g4 the king just gets to e4, and with these three pawns it's going to be very tough to defend for black. This is the best choice for black. Even that choice wasn't so bright, but at least it offered some hope. He went for bishop g8, which was making the bishop pretty passive. White took, and went for queen f8, getting his plan done. He wants to exchange queens. Naturally, black doesn't want to do that. He wants to get some counterplay by queen a5 and heading towards d2, trying to hit both these pawns on b2 and d3. Now, a very good move by white, rook f2, trying to control the second rank, cover from any queen d2 ideas. And now bishop e6 by black. And this was the critical moment. This was the very important moment in which white played rook e2 and allowed black to get some counterplay. With rook e2, he was trying to stop queen e1 potential counterplay, but the best move here was to play g4, which looks a bit insane, but it makes lots of sense. And the reason why it makes lots of sense is that after queen e1, there's knight g2, and after queen c1, you see how the king is very, very safe. There are no checks. White's queen can just go to e8. The next move is going to be rook f8 with checkmate on h8. And there's nothing that black can do in this position. After bishop e6, g4 was the crushing move with the next queen e8, rook f8. He played rook e2, and now after a3, black is getting some counterplay, because after capturing, the d3 pawn is under some pressure, and also the reason why it works for black is that the rook and queen are not connected really well. And after queen d6, there is bishop c4. White took, and now queen g3. And now king h1, because he wants to avoid some pins on the g file. Let's say if king g1, queen h4, white is not able to capture on c5, because then h3 also hangs, and the position becomes equal. But he goes to h1 instead. Queen takes h4, and now queen c5. White is a pawn up, but the situation is not so simple, because the rook is now very, very free. it can go to g6, f6, and so on and so on. It's not the same like in the case we had the knight on h4, when the rook was not so mobile. It's much different now. Queen goes to f4 first, to allow its rook to get to g6, because the e5 pawn is under attack. Now queen e3. He tries to exchange queens, which would be very, very useful to white. He doesn't accept this, of course, because there's a passed pawn. King h2, and now rook g6. He's trying to use his rook to defend against the c pawn. White pushes, and now rook c6. White has to support his pawn one more time by rook c2, and now queen d1. Queen f2. White is having everything under control, but it's not easy to find a way to advance, because you need somehow to push this rook from c6, but also you have to make your king safe from any checks. Black keeps pressure on white's pawns, plays this, and now queen f5. And in this position, king h8 is not really good because of rook b2 having these threats. Rook b8 and some back rank issues will appear. And in case of queen d8 to save against this, the e5 pawn is going to be lost, and again rook b8 is a threat. Actually, in this position, rook g6 is the only move. Now the rook is under attack, so rook f2. Having this rook f3 is a threat with rook g3 to pin the rook on g6. And in this position, black plays queen c3, which was a huge mistake, decisive one. It was better just to play queen g3, and after, let's say, king g1, to go back to e3 and to keep asking questions about the pin on the long diagonal. For example, if you play king h1 here, there's also queen e3, and if you push the pawn, there is queen c1 check, and you lose the pawn on c6. After king h1, queen e3, if you go rook c2, there is perpetual by queen e1 and this. If king g1, then there is this, and if you really want to not have a draw by queen f1, then e4 pawn hangs and it becomes more interesting. But Foreest plays queen c3 in the game, which allowed this. And now black achieves the material balance by capturing this pawn, but you have other issues. After h4, the big threat is h5. The forced answer was to play h5, giving up the pawn. After which rook g3 was played, queen d6, and now white has to be careful a bit not to open up the h-file too soon. He plays rook g5 first. He doesn't need to hurry with capturing on h5. He goes to c6, and now he plays g3. If queen takes e5, let's say, there's rook g5. After hg to preserve this pawn, this queen endgame doesn't look too easy to win. Queen endgames have this tendency that they're drawish because of potential perpetual check, and this is not maybe the way to go from white side. So he tries to gain a couple of pawns before entering some potential endgame, and he goes for g3. He tries to stabilize for now because he knows that the queen cannot mess around too much. It can give a check on c2, but it goes to h3, and you have to bring it back on the next move. Black played queen a6 here. In this position, white plays a really nice move, king h3. Not allowing any checks at the moment. The queen has to stay on the 6th rank because of the rook. It's not possible to give a check on f1, which is very important. So he just shuffles. White took on h5, and then took on e5. And again, queen cannot be too active because of some queen e8 checkmates. So black plays rook d6. Queen c5, and now queen d7. Queen f5. And also there are some ideas like queen h7, rook f5, getting the king in the open, and eventually getting checkmate. To avoid exchanging queens, he plays rook e6, but after this, black is under a different pin. This time on the g8, a2 diagonal. And this more or less forced black to capture on d5, because if he tries something like queen e7 to defend the pawn, to defend the rook, which looks like a pawn, rook e5, and the pawn endgame is just completely winning. So he took, but after ed, white is simply 2 pawns up in the endgame, and we had a couple of more moves, but nothing helped Van Foreest. After rook f5, black resigned because he has to now choose between two sides. If he goes to the left side, to the e7 square, he's going to suffer from these two pawns on this side. If he goes to g8, he will slowly improve, but eventually he'll get his king out, defend the g pawn, and start pushing the d pawn, which is going to result into a loss. And that's why Van Foreest resigned here, because there was no hope for recovery. The troubles began, I think, when the rook went to g5, making it much tougher than it should be. By simply exchanging this and going for queen d7, maybe he was afraid of knight g6, but actually that was not such a big problem. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section. I will get back to you, and have a good day. Bye.